I think my view of the internet, unfortunately, hasn't changed much over the years since its inception. You know, and I worry sometimes that that's a conceptual and a generational thing, that slightly older people, if you like, reached adulthood before the internet existed, are always going to have a conceptual problem with it, as they do with any majorly transformative technologies in this way. So, you know, just to sort of prefigure anything I might say about the kind of you know, moral effects of this medium or this means of communication, I have to kind of make that statement that, you know, I well remember I was running a business in the late 1980s, early 90s, and a man came to sell me the idea of the internet, and I couldn't actually figure out what he was talking about. I couldn't actually see what one would use it for, and I know that seems like a kind of strange idea 20 odd years down the line, but that actually was the case. And I think then if I look towards the kind of early to mid 90s, I remember writing a piece at that time, you know, kind of that in some ways kind of presages some of the issues that have now arisen around the internet, in that my anxiety at that point was that people would become emotionally and intellectually dependent upon it, more so than practically dependent upon it. I don't think even at that point, although the dot-com boom was about to get underway, I quite grasped the implications of e-commerce. But I did sort of get the idea that people were going to be communicating and conceptualizing much more in a effectively virtual space, and relying upon that virtual space for their information in a way that they hadn't beforehand. By that time, by the mid-1990s, I was already thinking in terms of vulnerable people, or at any rate people who were whose kind of ego boundaries, to use a rather pop psychological term, were perhaps becoming rather fluid and rather indeterminate, finding themselves in some ways merging with this virtual space, identifying with themselves as virtual people rather than actual people, and having a kind of semi-permeable sense of who they were. And I wondered and mused at that time, and this is going back a decade and a half, whether there might, you know, if the internet crashed in some way, whether or not these people might also crash. They might psychologically crash in that way. And I think that anybody who started to think about the internet at that time as an emergent technology, although it would be kind of arrogant and kind of incorrect in my case to say that we in any way foretold the rise of social media sites, I think we were thinking about the kinds of things that might be implied by something like social media sites were they to actually exist. This was all just off the back of seeing the obsessional involvement with email and the obsessional involvement with actually kind of surfing the web itself. But of course, you know, by the mid-1990s, internet chat rooms of one sort or another were beginning to get going as well, even though that they were somewhat recherche taste. And I think none of this really kind of exploded until there was broadband. So I've always had these concerns about how people are going to interact psychologically through the internet and with the World Wide Web. I've always been very, very suspicious of what's involved in it, seeing my own behaviour really around the internet and the web, though I've never been particularly tempted into chat rooms. I could see that, you know, were I younger perhaps, were I slightly different, were I kind of vulnerable in different ways to the ways I am, that is something that would be attractive. I mean, all of us who interact with the web via the internet know how obsessive compulsive it is. And if we don't admit to it, we're lying. We've all done it. We've all senselessly checked our email, or, I mean, I personally don't have anything to do with social networking sites, but I can imagine that they're even more compulsive because There is a facility there for constantly seeing whether somebody's noticing you. And then that's the sort of crux of, so that kind of experience, and then you see with kids who play the games obsessively that quite clearly they're going on gaming in their minds even when they're not on the console. And if access is denied to this instant feedback device, people become very much like laboratory rats who are denied a hit of cocaine, having become accustomed to them. And it doesn't really take much imagination to wonder, well, what would it be like in once, as undoubtedly will be the case, once the technology improves to the point that the virtuality is that much more convincing, once it improves to the point which is already being mooted, and I believe may be possible in some forms, of kind of implanting some of the technology directly into the brain so that it's experienced without the kind of relatively crude interface of a kind of plastic piano and a kind of an actual screen in front of you, but it's actually just going on in that way. What's it going to be like if it crashes in some sense? What's it going to be like if it goes down? We already see these kind of slightly crazed responses when the internet goes down. You certainly do at my house. I can tell you when the internet goes down, there's a lot of baying and tramping and thudding around, and it really goes back to my initial worries 15 years ago that there could be some kind of mass collective psychic crash involved if it were to go down.